it okay if we make this funk thing go again? Can I start? Can I take off? Yeah. Mothership will land, but when the horns blow, you know it's time to go. All right? So, I think we'll be all right. No technical difficulties, but I think we can make up in sound and spirit what your eyes can't see. They say faith is the evidence of things unseen, but so is the. All right, we're gonna start. First of all, I can't thank Dr. Sharon Grotto enough. Such an extraordinary occasion. This is my second time visiting the campus. I was here once before, and I was really probably only 50 deep in my oral history interviews at that point. I think that's triple. We're somewhere around 150 deep. Not just knee deep, but totally deep. I also want to thank Dr. Caroline Merrilew, staff, good supporter of the funk, Yvette Moore-Holman, Dr. Todd Allman as well, Yeoman. It is truly an honor to have been invited to share and learn at the very first Dayton Funk Symposium and Dance Party presented by the Growl Charity Arts and Languages here at the University of Dayton. Notice I said the very what? First. Which means there will be a second and a third. And then we go 1, 2, 3, 4. That's right. 4 and then some more. So, if you all don't mind, I'm going to get right into it. Can I do that? I have to express my indebtedness to the people who have really helped me with this research project. One of the first historians to ever write on funk, Dr. Ricky Vincent, curator of an exhibit on funk here, and did a lot of early work in terms of artifacts, Michael Sampson, members of Slave like Cedell Carter, Harry McLeod, Keith and Devoria Harrison, who we have here with us, Lamar Webster, Charles Jackson, and numerous members of the Dayton community, I have to say, have welcomed me over the years, and most recently, the tremendous work of David Webb and the Funk Center have been extremely valuable as a resource. Did any of you all get to go to the museum? Did you get to go to the museum today? And again, like this symposium, it's only the beginning. Let me begin by acknowledging the pathway also forged by independent historians. A lot of us with our degrees don't recognize the work that grassroots people engage in as far as documenting their own story. And I'm thinking of WDAO's radio station former program director, Dr. Turk Logan, who wrote a book, The Reality of a Fantasy, detailing his role in bringing Dayton artists to the airwaves here. I don't know if you have control over the mic. You can actually bring that down, please, if you have control over the volume. Logan went on to pen an introduction to another locally published memoir that was discussed earlier by Greg Webster, former leader and drummer of the Ohio Players. Funk is more than a four-letter word. It is a musical style that peaked in popularity during the latter 70s and into the 80s, and it was born of intersecting and pre-existing traditions in African American music. Everything from gospel, blues, jazz, rhythm and blues, soul, rock, anything in between and beyond. This infectious, danceable style emphasizes rhythm and a set of sound relationships known as the groove. The term funk, interestingly enough, never received official sanction on the Billboard charts, but many artists, solo and groups, consider themselves funk artists. So it has a sort of underground quality to it, right? So we talk about that funky worm is underground. All right? And the funk has sort of stayed underneath the surface. Everybody knows it's there, but it's sort of this resource that we constantly go back into tapping. Historians have located the linguistic roots of the term funky to Central African languages. In the latter 60s and 70s, James Brown, Sly and Family Stone, and Parliament Funkadelic made foundational contributions to the making of funk as a popular genre. Building on styles and commercial successes of trendsetters, a slew of self-contained bands would follow, adding their own stamp on the funk. Just to name a few: Mandrill, the Ohio Players, Earth, Wind and Fire, the Meters, Graham Central Station, the Isley Brothers, the Brides of Funkenstein, the Bar-Kays, Confunction, Rick James and the Stone City Band, Pleasure, the Brothers Johnson, Cameo, Mass Production. I can go on and on and on, but time is of the interest here. So over the years, I've raised questions about the possibilities for thinking about funk, not just as a sonic set of relationships, but as a set of relationships that are connected to socioeconomic realities and also various forms of cultural struggle. And that's really what I want to do. Now, I've been lecturing on this for a while, so actually it may look like I'm freestyling, but I'm not. However, glutton for punishment that I am, I said, you know, this time I want to do something different. I don't want to talk about the same old thing I've been. So I pulled an all-nighter, so you're going to get some fresh funk from me, and I'm going to take a different angle on this. To claim that Dayton, Ohio is a historical epicenter of bands that were instrumental to the making of funk may seem unbelievable or even suspicious to skeptics. So let's clear the air. I am not from Dayton. I'm from Rochester, New York, a city just like Dayton. We just got Kodak and you all had GM. But bands and their relationship to working class towns is something that you'll see across geographies. What Rochester did not have is a force of nature known as the Ohio Players, who stayed in Dayton and were able to shepherd a whole slew of other groups. If you look at groups like Phazo, Slade, Lakeside, if you listen to the interviews, they all talk about having another world of possibility based on the fact that they can go to the supermarket, you might see a baby blue Lamborghini with sugar written on the side of it. You might see an Excalibur, but people in this small city could see the end of the rainbow as far as what was possible in ways that people in most smaller cities could not. Rick James from Buffalo, New York, an hour away from Rochester. Rick James moved to Los Angeles. So many artists from smaller cities. Not accidentally, Minneapolis has a similar relationship with Prince. Why? Because he maintained a large presence in that small industrial city. Had he not gotten a record deal, that would not mean that there would be any less number of musicians in that city. Sometimes celebrity gives us what we call in history the lamppost effect. It shines a light on the street, but there's a lot of other things in the street. And so when you have commercial success, it can shine a light, but that doesn't always mean that there aren't forms of indigenous creativity going on that we don't spot. Let me move on to the topic at hand. I mentioned some of the groups like Phazo. I mentioned this group, Slade. I don't have to go through the groups. You all believe me, right? That this is a funk capital. You believe me? Okay, good. I'm so glad I don't have to do that quantitative analysis. Dayton's special contribution to popular music is a history that raises questions beyond beats, sounds, notes, and artist biographies. What were the relationships between local music traditions and changing socioeconomic positions as I talked about, and also the dynamic of the Black public sphere. Youth, parents, teachers, public schools, churches, record stores, managers, disc jockeys, radio stations, recreation centers, recording studios, vinyl pressing plants, and the dynamic of race and power at the macro level of the music industry. Band members developed their craft and approaches to music in urban communities and public spheres, as I said earlier, anchored in Black working class life. Now, I typically spend a lot of time on the latter 70s. I want to move to another very important decade in the funk. That being the 1980s, that distant period way back that we want to unearth. Songwriters Will Shelby of Dynasty and Steve Shockley of Lakeside placed a Gem City stamp on the final year of the 70s. The pair, along with producer Leon Silvers, penned the song "And the Beat Goes On" by the Whispers. The tune shunned the blues in favor of a tenacious optimism. Now I understand myself when I'm down. Lead vocalist Wallace and Walter Scott sang, "Like the sweet sound of hip music," they continued, "there'll always be something new." To keep the tables turning, the instrumentation affirmed this message just as strongly as did the lyrics. The Motown-style quintet stacked silky harmonies on top of a groove more commonly heard on songs by R&B and funk bands rather than vocal groups. The combination of crisp doo-wop sounds and funky rhythms were infectiously demonstrative. However, life's beat goes on, but clearly the beat did not go on as planned in the 1980s. How did that beat change in the 80s? How were new beats made? And what were the consequences for the many bands of Dayton, Ohio who had acquired an unprecedented number of recording contracts in the latter 70s? The beat was evolving alongside changing sound preferences in Black music. Self-contained bands signed to what were called Black R&B or Black or soul divisions on major labels were confronted by the disruptive headwinds in the 1980s. Some hurdles were due to come with the territory of just being a band. And I'm sure there are many here, musicians, who can attest to the fact that even during the best of times, the band is a difficult unit to keep together. Creative differences, factions, financial disputes are par for the course in the experiences of bands, no matter the style or type of music. Other challenges that Black bands encountered were completely outside the realm of personal control. Tragic events, changes in consumer tastes, and changes in the music industry. The big bands of R&B and funk were fading fast in the 1980s. Due to these changes, only certain groups endured. I'll just list some of the ones that adjusted: the Gap Band, Cameo, Midnight Star, and then some bands became solo artists. George Clinton, the Dance Band, and Tume, The Time, Full Force, The Deal, the Isaac Brothers, Climax, the SOS Band were just some that you can hear in the soundscape throughout the 80s. Dayton artists fought, though, an uphill battle to create in spite of the difficulties of this decade. I'm going to talk about this paradigm of knowledge production that I see in the 80s resistance that funk presents. I'll use examples from three major groups, though you can use these kinds of challenges to the established order for any of the groups that are a part of this scene and others. I want to talk primarily about, maybe not in that order, but we'll see. Heat Wave, Roger Troutman and Zapp, and Lakeside. Heatwave, Roger Troutman and Zapp, and Lakeside. I think I can pull this off. Let me move to the end of the paper first, because I actually want to start with Heatwave. Heatwave's first two LPs, Too Hot to Handle and Central Heating, went platinum with a string of hits. Boogie Nights, Ain't No Half Steppin', classic wedding song, Always and Forever, which has stuck around for how long? Always and Forever. Groove Line. The third LP, Hot Property, also went gold. Leader and co-lead singer with his brother Keith Wilder, Johnny Wilder, was in a terrible, terrible car accident that changed Heatwave's destiny in early 1979. And tragically, he was involved in an accident that left him paralyzed from the neck down. In a testimony to the boundless power of the human spirit, Wilder, in a severe quadriplegic state, incredibly returned to singing, songwriting, co-producing, and leading the band. This was not a solo effort. Johnny's wife, Rosin Wilder, is an unsung hero. She worked persistently through these traumatic circumstances and helped Johnny forge the way of living that made it possible for him to continue to work as a creative artist throughout his daily struggles. The solidity of Heatwave's brotherhood was also a critical ally. Johnny recalled that fellow band member Billy Jones came in every other day while he was in the hospital, and we practiced, he said, building my voice by singing. Over time, Johnny's voice progressively became stronger. Johnny and Rosin Wilder's determination and Heatwave's unbreakable bonds of support enabled him to rebuild the breathing strength to produce the pristine tonal qualities that made his voice among the most inimitable. I'm getting tongue-tied here. The most difficult to copy in American popular music. The extraordinary international band was on course to continue its late 70s surge into a new decade. Wilder's determination to sing was again matched only by his resolve to keep the band together. Now, this is an international group. Members Czechoslovakia, member from Spain, members from the UK, members from the US, of course, members from Dayton, Ohio, at one point members from Chicago. It's an international band. Incredibly, Johnny Wilder came back to sing, but even more interesting, he had the Heatwave members trek across Europe, trek across the Atlantic, and settle into an apartment complex here in Dayton. The band moved to Dayton after the accident. They practiced together and worked. Bound to a wheelchair, Wilder did not perform with the band on stage during this period, but attended their shows and worked with the lighting and sound systems. Johnny's friend J.D. Nicholas and from the UK took on the role as lead singer. Johnny's perfectionist fervor did not waver. He had even set up a way to communicate directly with band members during performances through an intercom system. Keith Harrison, formerly of Faisal, joined Heatwave in 1981. Harrison recalled during concert performances, Johnny would sit out by the board. No, I'm not going to imitate Keith's voice. Johnny would sit out by the board with a microphone, only we could hear him in the monitors and the audience couldn't, he said. In the instance that Wilder heard a note that was off key. Harrison continued, "You're up there playing and you're singing, and all of a sudden you hear this voice that says, 'Keith Harrison, you're flat.'" Heatwave's strivings for excellence on stage found an equivalent on wax. The album Candles in 1980 delivered trademark aspects of the Heatwave sound. Lots of beautifully stacked harmonies, rich tenor tone verses, good feeling lyrics, syncopated and ever danceable rhythms. And as was discussed earlier, one of the greatest songwriters in pop music history was a member of Heatwave named Rod Temperton. And he continued to write for the group, even though he was producing hit after hit after hit after hit with the Quincy Jones production company, giving hits to the greatest pop artists of all time, Michael Jackson and many, many, many others. Heatwave returned to the UK thereafter to record another album, Current. But I want to suggest here that what you heard and the accomplishment of that sound is an act of resistance that we have to think about. And I set all this up before we can actually listen to the song, because far too often in music history and in history, we have this notion of there being some kind of meritocracy. You see, the cream rises to the top because it deserves to be the case. And when we talk about history and social movements, we raise questions about that. We say, well, wait a minute, there were other possibilities. Music history has been slow to replicate that sentiment. Far too often you hear in a passage about a group like Heatwave in the 80s, those were very good albums, but they didn't chart well. And that becomes the end of the discussion. I share with you today that that is the least interesting aspect of the story. Are you all with me?
Yeah.
I'm going now. I'm just getting warmed up, but I'm just getting going. So yeah, it takes me a while. That Mountain Dew has to kick in. But let me tell you, I'm setting all this up because I want to situate your ears politically and philosophically so you can hear what is accomplished. And so let's listen to a song that was off the album called Candles. Not that one. That's Groove Money. That's not it. See, this is where now I'm acting like I wish I had my vision. Okay, that's all right. We'll find it. And it's called Where Did I Go Wrong? I might have to just play it another way. Okay, here it is.
I remember the days we were both
recorded with Johnny have talked about the pain if they had a singing assignment of having to do it over and over again, particularly when he was collaborating with Rod. Or if you had the endurance to watch him stack note on top of note in such a way that you can almost not distinguish one track from the other. That's how smooth. And this is after the accident. Wilder would eventually move away from popular music and record some very beautiful a cappella gospel albums, one of which is called My Goal. I share this story because part of the paradigm that I'm talking about, the funk paradigm, is not necessarily just about the genre of funk. It's about the spirit of resilience. So I have a kind of activist twitch in my unstretched muscle that wants to speak to these times. So if you think about the level of resilience and the idea of human possibility, Johnny Wilder, I found articles where he says, I don't want your sympathy, but he wanted his music to be heard. And if we understand this period adequately, then I think we have to step outside of whatever evidence and conclusions the charts will yield. I want to move to another group, and the sound of this group is very different from what you just heard, but also I want to change our frame of mind as far as how we think about this group and how we hear their music. That's the problem of go. That's all. Now let's see what we can do here on the other side. Music. Need more music. Quiz. And those who have heard it before, don't cheat and holler out the answer. More bounce to the ounce. What is Roger talking about? What is more bounce to the ounce? What's bouncing? Come on now, don't holler out at once. Oh, who said that? See what I mean? That's cheating. That's cheating. You know you wanted to say the bass line. You know you wanted to say ass and shaking and everything else. Please. Roger said that he was inspired by the idea of talking about paychecks that bounce. Because when your paycheck bounces, what can you do? You might as well go ahead on and party because there's nothing you can do about it. Now, that sentiment, I think, speaks to something else that we should consider when engaging the legacy of Roger and Zach that has not been discussed, but again, can shape our auditory filter to better understand the resistance that was put forth in the 1980s. There's so much to be learned and discussed about Roger and Zach, some of which defies the time accordingly. The tragic loss of Roger and Larry Troutman in 1999 and the ongoing resiliency of the Troutman family and also recent comeback of Zapp, and the re-energizing of many who participated in Zapp's extended musical family may obscure a powerful 1980s story that goes well beyond the rich musical legacy before us. Affairs of the heart and partying were not the only areas of social concern expressed in Zapp and Roger's music. Roger described his music as, quote, the Black experience. It's the blues for the 80s. It has the same purpose with Black people, he said, as the blues had for Black people when B.B. King started out, or Jimmy Reed, end quote. But blues was not merely a musical reference point for Zapp and Roger. It was also an inspiration for concern about the widespread job loss in urban areas throughout the United States. Anxieties about these hard times appear in a number of Roger and Zapp songs. So Rough, So Tough, 1981. Playing Kinda Rough, 1982. We Need the Buck in 1983. And a tribute to Jesse Jackson in 1989. Within the walls of the Sound Labs, the Troutman Production Company deployed a model inspired by Parliament Funkadelic and its mastermind, George Clinton, by producing artists who had contracts with a variety of labels. So using the same personnel to have contracts with different labels and creating different sounds with different producers, sometimes the same personnel as well. For example, New Horizons was on Columbia Records. Dick Smith, also known as Hula Bula, Warner Brothers. The Human Body on Bearsville Electra. Bad, Bobby Glover on Columbia. Sugarfoot, former lead singer of the Ohio Players solo album, Warner Brothers. Shirley Murdoch, Electra. Roger's son, known as Lynch, on Capitol. And the ambassador of the funk in Scotland, who's here with us today, Jesse Ray with WEA. Beyond music, Zapp and Roger were affiliated with a major effort to create solutions for a community ravaged by massive layoffs and the contraction of social spending on the part of state and local governments. Troutman Enterprises, founded in 1980, sought to answer the urban blues condition with entrepreneurial activism, situating solutions to problems as part of its primary mission. The enterprises, recording studios, a construction firm, a limousine service were committed to training and employing displaced African American workers and youth in Dayton. Larry Troutman was the president of Troutman Enterprises. His brother Rufus was the vice president who ran the daily functioning of the construction company. Loretta Troutman, Roger's sister, defied gender conventions, working as an electrician for the company. In 1983, the Dayton Daily News took note of the unique business configuration, centering community restoration at the center. The article mused, not too many companies these days are putting up as many houses as Troutman Enterprises, a Black building firm. Even fewer companies are taking money out of profitable businesses during an economic recession and a housing depression to build houses with inexperienced labor and sometimes at a loss, end quote. Strategically, the company rehabilitated low-cost homes purchased from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. After reinvesting in these properties, these homes were made available for rent or purchase to lower moderate income families. As an artist, and it's important, this is where you can see the artist not just as a musician, but also as a philosopher, that these things are not separate worlds in the way that we tend to think of them. Roger embraced music as a philosophical glue that tied the construction business to his career. He described the construction business in terms of reciprocal pleasures, exchanged between musicians, audiences, and listeners in performance and recording. Quote, I noticed when we would do live shows that people would feel good. But they would not only feel good until that night, then we started making records and I noticed people could pick up the record and prolong that feeling a little longer. Unsatisfied by what he saw as the limited capacity of music to produce sustained happiness, Roger regarded community development as a more permanent solution to people's long-term needs. We started doing things in our construction company, getting people into different neighborhoods and refurbishing homes, turning debilitated houses into beautiful ones, and then reinstating those tenants back into that property to see the look on their face and how happy they are. It's the same sensation, but the difference between the records and the shows and doing something for somebody's home is that every time they are always in their home and the feeling is just almost a lifetime. The enterprise has also bucked tradition by placing priority on collaborating with local businesses, etc. So very few people discuss when talking about Roger and Zap this important context for thinking about what the group accomplished. So I gave you an example of tremendous resilience that we can emulate. I just gave you another example through the funk of a high level of community service that we can emulate. But now I want to get to something that's one of the most important challenges to funk bands that occurred in the 1980s. And that is enduring the conflicts that come from touring with Rick James and the Stone City Band. Almost all the groups in the 80s, New Edition, I just saw a video, New Edition had struggles with Rick James. New Edition, they were 15. Prince in 1980 on the Fire It Up tour had clashes with Rick James. Roger Troutman and Zap had conflicts with Rick James, particularly if they left that stage a little too hot before the headliner comes out. Charlie Murphy stories, Dave Chappelle stories pale in comparison to the reality of dealing with Rick James. I want to share with you a story of an important group that was able to endure a very trying circumstance with Rick James, that being the group known as Lakeside. Lakeside is one of the groups that would leave Dayton, Ohio for Los Angeles and signed to a record label called Solar Records. Solar Records stood for the sound of Los Angeles Records, even though that sound would come from a lot of Ohio musicians. Band Lakeside, almost all completely populated by musicians from Ohio. Great songwriter, member of the group Dynasty, Will Shelby, from Dayton, Ohio. Brother is also in Lakeside. Songwriters from Lakeside would also write for other artists like Steve Shockley, guitarist, really instrumental in that sound. Great songwriter, unsung hero, Dana Myers, Dayton, Ohio. Tremendous songwriter, shaping that sound in collaboration with Los Angeles producer, underrated legend Leon Silvers. So you have this way that sound migrates. So I talk to my students about the migration of sound. You listen to, rather than play it, I think I'm just going to say it, and then that's going to be your homework assignment until we get back next year. Listen to the guitar part on And the Beat Goes On. And then, if your memory takes you there, listen to the guitar part on Billie Jean. I'm just saying. Check it out. Now, Lakeside opened up for Rick James on the Budweiser Superfest tour. And Rick James was very upset that Lakeside had the crowd singing Fantastic Voyage and All the Way Live, So Hot. They had flash pots, they had dry ice, they had all these major effects that's supposed to be, from his view, reserved for the headline. So the king of punk funk made a decree. He said, no flash pots, no explosives, no dramatic stuff, and absolutely no touching that piano. That piano is reserved for the Stone City Band. And because Lakeside had gotten so many important performance opportunities with the Budweiser Superfest that they were on with Rick James, 83, 84, they decided, there's 9 of them in the room. They didn't really have a fearless leader like Slade, or a sax like the Ohio Players, or a Byron Bird like Sun. They were much more of a raise your hand and vote. So they're arguing, what are we going to do, man? They got to get that money on tour, okay? The worst thing you want to do is have the headliner not go on stage and create a riot. This is still Rick James. You know how many hits he's got? Okay, they decide that they're going to obey the dictum. Only to, just as they're about to go on stage, encounter a member of Rick James's road crew who sticks his head in the door and says, what y'all gonna do now? Showtime, the flash pots go off and they are going all out. There's a song that's a remake that Lakeside does, a Beatles classic, I Wanna Hold Your Hand. It wasn't really done as a remake to try to cross over. It was really done as a way to let listeners hear their ability to flip a song and make it their own, the kinds of things they did when they were a show band. If you listen to I Wanna Hold Your Hand, the first part of that song is the intro on the piano. Norman Beavers. Defying the decree. Rick James' security, actually in the middle of the show, attempts to physically dislodge Norman Beavers from the piano. Without going into detail, let's just say that that strong arm tactic was repelled and the show continued. Countless stories like that that really epitomize the battle of the band spirit that we talked about earlier, that continued throughout the 1980s, where the stage was where the energy, the creativity, the fearlessness was a terrain to show and prove. That equation was not an equation that any charts can pick up. So to think about this paradigm, I'm not talking about a paradigm, I'm literally talking about, hey brother, can you paradigm? As Prince and George Clinton would say. How do you make something out of nothing and turn it into a model? And that was really the spirit in a time of a very repressive conservatism, that everyday people here in Dayton, in bands that had recording contracts and those that did not, bands that had splintered and those who had stayed together, factions of groups, the trio of writers like Clarence Willis, Jimmy Diamond Williams, and Billy Beck. You'll find them on the Dayton records. You'll find them on Sugarfoot's album. But there are ways that people struggled in the 80s that is like the funk, as I said earlier, and also like faith. It rests in evidence of things unseen. Thank you.
All right.
We got through it. Well, any questions? Comments? I know that the history of Dayton is filled with so many geniuses. That's another theme of Dayton is genius, multi-instrumental genius. Musicians in Dayton, I mean, they'll be playing a guitar one minute and they'll jump on keys. You know, that's really something special. So I know I may have overlooked some of that in the interest of trying to craft a story, but please, any comments, questions, feel free. Yes?
I have a question about venues in Dayton, or locations. Just
Yes.
Living here and being curious about where history actually took place. Where were you living in Dayton? The heat wave when they were living in Dayton. I'm sorry.
Oh yes.
Or where were they playing? Were they practicing or recording in particular?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Harrison.
Yes, sir.
Where was the apartment complex that heat wave was staying at?
Okay.
It was on Cornell Woods Drive. And the apartment was called Country. I remember it very well because Bilbo lived up over me. And the apartment manager said you could not have a fish tank, 90-gallon fish tank on the second floor. Mr. Bilbo decided to have a 90-gallon fish tank on the second floor. And one day, water started coming down from my ceiling. Because he let it overrun. So it was Country Brook apartments on Cornell.
And Bilbo's from Czechoslovakia. And if you're talking about venues where groups perform, so that you have so many different levels. So you have groups that perform in clubs. You have some groups that were comprised of in the 1980s that were members of veteran bands. Like let's say after he leaves the Ohio Players, Mr. Satchel forms a group, Satch and Company, that, of course, when with the Ohio Players, he's playing big arenas and he's playing clubs here in Dayton, Ohio. And so those types of things happen. You may have had a tremendous pianist, songwriter like Billy Beck, who in the 80s is also a staff writer with Roger Troutman and Zapp. And so there are ways that people are performing and writing in the 80s, the club scene, medium-sized venues, and then also the wider, what some call just a network of clubs between cities. Some call it the Chitlin Circuit, but there's a wide Midwestern circuit, and there's also a wider national circuit of ways that Black public spheres interconnect with one another that provide performance venues for artists.
I didn't have the opportunity to attend some of the other lectures, but I wonder if you could sort of summarize how you would characterize funk as a musical genre, and then you also called it an auditory resistance.
Yes.
Could you say a little more about that?
Sure.
Like, what are the characteristics
Sure.
of
No, I got you. When I interviewed Sugarfoot, Leroy Sugarfoot Bonner, he had an expression that he would say to me. He made me bring my bass, of course, when I did the interview, and I had to stumble through Skin Tight. At the time, there was a lot of pressure with him there. But when I got fancy, he would say, Scott, simplicity is as great as design. And that has a lot to do with the funk in terms of, if you took away the individual parts, I played a song by Fazo earlier.
If you take away some of those individual parts, they might even seem repetitive, but the way that they relate to one another. So if you think about the instruments as pieces of a drum set in the way that James Brown thought about music, and then the expansion of that when you have improvisations and vocal musings on top of it. So there's no one definition, but the focus is relationships. So if you are into African drumming, you have the djembe drum, you have the junjun drum. Those individual parts are not very fun necessarily to play or listen to by themselves. But if you ever listen to a group of African drummers when they do an African dance and it sounds like because it's the relationship of those individual pieces. And that relationship is what's special about funk that gives us this thing we call the groove. It doesn't mean that that relationship did not exist before. I'm talking about more what is the emphasis. So with all of these genres, people like to have fixed ideas about a line of demarcation, but there's a lot of overlap in music in particular. Now, so that's the part, that's what I feel about funk. I think the funk formula is still very much at the center of popular music, and it just expresses itself in different ways. I forget the other part of your question.
Auditory resistance.
Yes, well, a lot of funk bands, a lot of self-contained bands emerge as, we always have, especially in a highly concentrated system with large amounts of corporate wealth that can do a very, very quick job of absorbing things and making them kind of get worn out. There was a way that bands were pushing back against the dominance of vocal groups, particularly of the Motown variety. And so Sly and the Family Stone, that was a big departure from, let's say, like the Temptations. And also the democracy within the group. So if you look at Sly and the Family Stone, you'll notice Larry Graham on bass is actually standing closer to the audience than Sly. Remember, it's Sly and the Family Stone, but Sly is back here. So there's a democratic ethos in placement, place and space, that's part of the leanings of the band. Now, there are bands that are not funk bands. Not all bands are funk bands. Not all funk musicians are in bands. But that's sort of what is dominant in funk, is the band as the predominant unit of artistic expression. Now I hope I didn't really mess that up. Y'all gonna play that tape back and be like, oh. Yes.
So thank you for a wonderful presentation. I sort of want to build off of the previous question. I was really struck by the first example that you played, the heat wave, Where Did I Go Wrong?
Yes.
And what was really striking to me was that it was in compound meter. It sounded like it was in 6/8 or 12/8. And it seems like what has become sort of a predominant, at least sort of musicological understanding of what funk is that it sort of moves away from that compound meter, and that it's a lot of sort of 16th note divisions, and it's primarily in 4/4. Yeah. And so I'm wondering if we can sort of hear Heat Wave's sort of invocation of that compound meter as sort of adding to the kind of resistance that you're talking about, whether it be from maybe record companies trying to sort of solidify a particular sound,
yes,
or like a particular rhythmic organization for funk. I wonder if that is a way that we can think about the kinds of resistance that you're talking about.
Sure, I think the timing is a part of it, but there's also a kind of classic quality, especially its allusions to doo-wop and the feat of one person really doing most of those harmonies in that song. That's kind of like a magic trick. And so and mind you, a group like Heat Wave has some funk songs, has some pop songs, has some songs that were big in the disco scene, has some dance. So it's not really about saying that's funk or not. I'm really thinking here more epistemologically in terms of this idea of resisting. But the resistance in Heatwave is from my perspective, the fact of this group creating so much beauty in spite, and I'm just talking about the loss of Johnny Wilder's body movements, but also the bass player, Mario Mentise, who had to leave the group, who was stabbed. There was a guitar player from Chicago. I mean, they went through multiple tragedies, and then they lost, as far as a presence in the group, their principal songwriter. And so, for me, the story is just in, the politics is in the way that beauty kind of comes out of that unit in spite of those things.
Yeah, my neighbors and I at dinner were talking a little bit about this, the geography of the networks between various cities. We talked a lot today about Dayton as, just all the conditions it created for musicians. But, can I hear the entrepreneurial activism that you were talking about? But what were some of the bases of these networks that made it possible for musicians to be touring across this region? And are there some dynamics? Are there times when those networks seem to crumble? Are there times when they're being built? Who's building it? Who are the players? Could you?
Oh no, that's a very, very interesting question. So you have this social movement that we call the Black Power movement. The institutionalization of Black Power, meaning the professional organizations actually go on even after the social movement is at its most kind of high-profile phase. So you have all these professional organizations, to a certain degree, even the Black record division. Some of the Black executives, like Larkin Arnold, he went to Howard University, he was friends with Stokely Carmichael. So they saw themselves as creating space for Black consumers to participate with more resources than what Black boutique labels were doing. You also have the activism of Dick Griffey, who's a concert promoter, and he forms the United Black Concert Promoters. Out of that organization, you have someone, very, very interesting person to study, Al Heyman, who is the #1, he's a Harvard graduate, #1 Northeast concert promoter. Interestingly enough, and then becomes a huge boxing promoter. If you try to find his picture online, you will be hard pressed. So the idea around building economic power as a foundation for leverage is a part of what's inspiring these networks. So we're dealing with Black promoters, trying to cooperate with other Black promoters, trying to also spread dollars into Black establishments, trying to get pieces of some of that big corporate money like the Budweiser Superfest. And you have also into the 80s, the impact of the organization called People United to Serve Humanity, led by Reverend Jesse Jackson, who leads a campaign against Warner Brothers and other record labels around this question of access to resources. So the network that I'm speaking of is also an extension of the social movement. It's just moving into professional spheres. You have Black Librarians Association. You have the Congressional Black Caucus. That's an example of that. And so it cuts across in all these ways and still kind of shapes things even into the 1980s. The Black Music Association is another one with led by Gamble and Huff and others. You're welcome. Yes, please.
I would like to question that maybe a little light. You mentioned that Dayton was like the engine room funk music. And so there were some good times in Dayton. And since then, Dayton has gone through some bad times.
Yes.
So part of what I do as a historian is to see how the past shaped the present and to use that to capture the future or to shape the future.
Yes.
So the larger question is that Dayton was a place at one point.
Yes.
How does funk, this story, how does it help Dayton to capture or shape that future?
Okay.
In order to get back on top.
Yes. Well, I think there are two things happening. I see funk as really you know how we talk about hip hop, people talk about what institutions were not in place. So let's say hip hop was born out of music not being in schools anymore. People, and so I think the funk story that I'm talking about is tied to a period in which a lot of those things were available. Music in the schools, relatively good wage jobs, etc., allowed sometimes single income families to still purchase instruments, to still have music lessons, etc. Going forward is the part that I think is the important part of this paradigm that I'm looking at, and it's forward thinking, and that is to move us beyond thinking about funk in a nostalgic way, but to think about it as part of the present struggle. So you have, for the moment, all kinds of economic and political activity that's funk related. Old school funk festivals, old school concerts, radio programming, nostalgic programs like Unsung. That's definitely, man, that program, Unsung. They're very nostalgic, you know. I'm making a joke about it because I've been on a couple of episodes. But so there's a way that we're engaging the past, but we can do so asking the kinds of questions. I don't think that we're going to be able to recreate the same kinds of things that happen. Ideas about community, space, and place change. But then to place the art in the context of these wider questions, I think, is where the struggle is now. I, for instance, when talking with young people, you know, I still record. You know, I want to be the next Rick James. I'm not saying it's not going to happen, but you know, the clock is ticking. However, I can stand here at University of Dayton as a music historian. So I talk to young people about all of these, especially African American young people, about all these jobs in the music industry that are not the artist jobs. Road manager. Road manager makes a killing. Accountants. People who understand contracts. So I'm thinking really in the Du Boisian sense of this as a possibility for organization. And not in a kind of Booker Washingtonian idea, but more to see this as decolonizing and changing the relationship between the art that working people produce and those who benefit from it. Dick Griffey said, black music is black people's oil, and it seems to be making everybody rich but those who produce it. So that is a political struggle. It's not just a cultural one.
You mentioned the group Lakeside moving to Los Angeles and signing with Solar Records, and if I remember, they were on ABC Records before that. And it made me think all of the Dayton Funk heavyweights that we discussed, they all signed with major labels like Daz Band on Motown, Sun on Capitol, Ohio Players on Mercury, etc. So with that said, are there any Dayton labels, Dayton-based labels that we should know about?
Well, there are Dayton labels, but well, they had some difficulties. One was formed by the Ohio Players, She Records, Serving Humanity and Equality. Faisal was. That's one explanation I heard for the title, by the way. I don't know if Keith shares that perspective. But that label was here. Air City Records that came later on in the 80s, Sun, and even the Ohio Players graduation album came out through there. But that is actually the core reason why Dayton does not have the notoriety as a music hub. Because when we think about music cities, we're usually conceiving them in that way because of the entrepreneurial activity, not the quantity of talent. So for instance, we say Stax and Soul because of the record company. We say, you know, Detroit, Motown, that's an engine. And, you know, beyond the talent that comes out of Detroit, there's a lot of talent that migrated to Detroit, not just for Motown, sometimes for Westbound, or the end of the Westbound, or, you know. So the entrepreneurial activity does not necessarily mean that there's a per capita more talent, more music happening there. But I think that has a lot to do with the branding of it. Yes, Keith?
You have a new label in Dayton called Jewel Key.
All right. And who are some of the artists on Jewel Key, Mr. Harrison?
Well, I know the CEO is Keith Harris.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think this is a very special time also, just going back to the future, and then we can go back. Right now, this is a period where artists can make music in ways that reduce the impact of gatekeepers that we have never seen before. We've never seen studio costs be so non-existent in the way that they are. We've never seen the independence of distribution in ways we have now. So I think there's a lot of possibilities as well. You know, we complain about a lot of the music, but I think the relationships are solid for us. Should we, what do you think? That, one or two more questions? Who had the hand up? I'm sorry, I lost track. Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, so this question is a comment of appreciation, but also for my students who are in the audience.
Okay.
And so the appreciation comes from your activism as a historian and your insistence that this history matters. And so I think that legacy is part of a tradition in historical study that, you know, we don't just get stories about the civil rights movement, or we don't just get stories about the women's rights movement, or whatever it is, that there are people out on the streets professionally and in the community who insist that history matters. And that's what Dr. Scott Brown is doing. And so I appreciate that, but it's such an important piece.
Well, I really appreciate that. You know, it wasn't that long ago when I would go to conferences and present on Dayton Funk, and it was kind of not taken very seriously because there is this sort of big city bias when we think about who makes culture. And so I had to deal with, first of all, I'm from Rochester, so if you dog out Dayton, you dogging out my hometown too, right? I'm from a medium, small city like very much like Dayton. Sometimes I think if I'm blindfolded and you drop me off somewhere, I will think I'm back home. Because we have porches and backyards and all that stuff just like folks do here. But what I wanted to say is that struggle is very important because I think we're going through a kind of funk. I don't know if it's a renaissance. I hope it becomes one. But there's an interest in it now, so it's hip again. You know, I'm listening to guitar strokes coming back on radio again. You didn't hear rhythm guitars dancing like that for a minute. I'm hearing some sounds that are there, and the question becomes really, are we going to be able to sustain that and translate that into people's interest in the lives of working people, even when it's not glamorous, even when it's not sexy. And you know, that's something that I think we have to struggle with.
Is there one more? Okay, let's give Scott.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, we're going to do a couple of special presentations tonight, but before that, I just wanted to make a few announcements. That's my job. It's not a very exciting job. I hope you all noticed in the first cut that Scott played the strings in the background. Did you all hear those strings? Very soft in the background. And I bring that up because in the 1970s in Washington, D.C., I played flute in backup orchestras like those strings for Isaac Hayes.
And so those kinds of woodwinds and string combinations were either cut in, you recorded and then added in the studio, or they were present in live performance, and they were local hires when a great artist was coming through. And parenthetically, we were paid in cash out of a briefcase every time. We won't talk about where that came from. Couple of announcements about tomorrow. Ricky Vincent's book on funk. Ricky will be here tomorrow. He's on the red eye from California, from San Francisco. He's going to have it for sale at the dance party, and he will sign the copies. Please don't lose your tickets, those of you who have tickets to the dance party, because there are no more. I'm sure some people will not show up who have tickets, so there may be some at the door, but you cannot get in without a ticket, and you must have an armband so that if you want to go out and use the restroom, you can get back in. I want to let you know that Stan Brooks, the Soul of Dayton radio DJ, is going to be playing some DJ funk music for the Continental Breakfast tomorrow morning at 8:30, the lunch at 12:20, and the Continental Breakfast on Friday at 8:30. So that's good motivation to get up and get over to the Torch Lounge in Kennedy Union. Some of you ate dinner on the 3rd floor, and you come in on the ground floor. The Torch Lounge is on the 1st floor. The ballroom is on the 2nd floor. We use every floor. So we're going to be on the 1st floor in the morning. Those of you who are staying at the Marriott, some people have had great luck using the shuttle to get over here. All you have to do is go to the desk tonight and tell them when you would like to go, ride the shuttle to get over here, to get over to the Kennedy Union Ballroom, so you don't have to bring your car. It's much better if you don't bring your car. Our parking is really jam-packed. And so the fewer cars, the better. There is a fairly long dinner break because of the necessity of having time to set up everything for tomorrow night. And in those of you who are presenters, you have folders that include a list of restaurants on Brown Street and also the description of the food services that are in Kennedy Union, so you can get to food without having to drive also. Caroline Merrithew, we missed your intro. Did you do it?
Oh, well, no. But
Because we had a rocky start here, but I want to.
Yeah, Scott is a great guy.
I want to thank Caroline for introducing me to Scott when he was here last time. That's how we happened to get him back. I said a lot of thank yous earlier today. I'm not going to repeat them all, even though some of you are here tonight who weren't here then. But I see Dave Larson in the audience, and I said earlier that we owe a great debt of gratitude to media and communication staff here at UD, Dave Larson for the College of Arts and Sciences, which resulted in my being dragged out to be interviewed for Channel 2 for the nightly news here. For those of you who don't turn on your TV, if you want to see, I hope they cut out some of the stuff I said, but we'll see. And I think that's it. I'd like to introduce now our wonderful Dean for the College of Arts and Sciences, Jason Pierce, and bring first to the stage David Webb from the Funk Hall of Fame. This is not a real check.
Sharon, you want to say the context?
Sure. The context is that we want to support the Funk Center and everything there that's going on. They have a wonderful collection of things. They have many things they don't have room to display. This is a great resource for our city, a great historical treasure, and it's to David Webb's leadership as president and CEO that this exists at all. And he's responsible, along with Gloria back there, Smith, for the tours this morning, which I know lots of you went on. So this is a donation to the center for $1,000 from the Grove.
I just want to say real quick, it's not me, it's my staff members. We have some of my staff members. You stand up real quick, some of my staff members. Nationwide to make this happen. It's not just David Webb. I have a team. Scott, and Keith Harrison back there in the back. A lot of people. CDL, stand up for a minute, CDL. Stand up. Oh, yeah. Right. These are a lot of people in the audience and stuff like that. Stand up, but Kenny. Clap this. Dr. Lee gave me a lot of donations and stuff, artifacts. These are the real stars, right there. And we have somebody from Slade back over here. Stand up. Come on. Where are you? And then, you know, wait a minute, come here, I forgot. This is one of, just come down here real quick. Come here. This is a lady, is an unsung hero, and I'm glad you said something. She's the one who did our murals, did a lot of the painting. She did a lot of artwork for us, and also she did a lot of outfits for a lot of local and national people. The Lord Buchanan. This lady, give her a round of applause. Her and my daughter did a lot of work for those murals, and I'm going to give her a round of applause. Big time. Thank you. No?
And I'd like to ask next Clarence Willis to come up, please. And I'm going to, we decided to honor Clarence at this event, this special symposium. Because he's a UD graduate, of course. Yeah.
It is just a real honor and a privilege to celebrate our UD alum, Clarence Willis. And so if you would indulge me, I'd like to read the words here to mark this occasion. So we're presenting this to Clarence Willis, University of Dayton class of 1972, on the occasion of the Dayton Funk Symposium and Dance Party at the University of Dayton, sponsored by the Grahl Chair in Arts and Languages. In recognition of his contributions to the long history of the funk movement in Dayton and as lead guitarist with the Ohio Players, presented by the University of Dayton College of Arts and Sciences and the Funk Music Hall of Fame and Exhibition Center, September 12, 2018, Dayton, Ohio.
Thank you all. Thank you.